So greetings, everybody. My name is Francis Voorhees, or Frank Voorhees, and I have the honor of being the director of an institute that we've launched at Stellenbosch University called the African Wildlife Economy Institute. Welcome to the first of our fireside chats. Will we be able to do a chat on Zoom? Well, let's give it a try. We're very happy to have 𝐏𝐫𝐸 Mokosha here as our principal guest, and hopefully if Esther Netshavawn-Graney can show up. Her internet connection is always tough where she lives. We've also invited her as a principal guest, but you all are guests for this event, and a wonderful turnout. Thank you all very much for coming. What we're involved with here is an attempt.
Hello, everyone.
Oh, hello.
Hello, everyone. I'm Esther.
Oh, hi, Esther. There you are. Okay, you're under the Mbweni one. There you go. Fabulous. Welcome, Esther. So we have Esther and 𝐏𝐫𝐸 as our lead folks on the session. And it's an informal session, no PowerPoint presentations, no videos, just a bit of a chat with two principal guests, Esther and 𝐏𝐫𝐸, to be able to share their reflections and then interact with us as a group on this topic. What we're involved with here is to put together a few fireside chats this month in response to initially the high-level panel report that came out from the Ministry of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment, which was completed at the end of last year and released in May. A spectacular piece of research, but very hard to get into. It's over 500 pages long, and our two guest speakers who are involved with it as members of the panel. It's a very extensive document that was focused on some iconic species and what we do with them: rhinos, elephants, lions, and so on. But as this session indicates, focusing on species is a piece of a much bigger puzzle of focusing on bigger systemic issues in the wildlife sector and the wildlife economy, including today's topic of transformation. So what we have is, we have now, in addition to a high-level panel report, we have a draft policy position from the department, from the minister, 𝐏𝐫𝐸, on these topics, and she has asked for comments this month, very short time period. And so with these 5 dialogues that we've put together today on transformation, Thursday on protected areas, next week on hunting and rhinos, and one more the week after next on lions, we hope to be able to put in some comments from the Institute to the department about some high-level issues to consider, primarily on how to implement policy, on policy implementation. So that's the theme here. And also at the same time, we encourage everybody on the call to put in your own comments. The government really needs feedback on these ideas. They're moving very fast with some very, very big issues and very important issues, but ones that require a lot of careful planning if we're going to go from beyond talk and into real implementation. So with that, this session's on transformation, on inclusiveness in the wildlife sector, the wildlife economy, which you could think of in sort of 3 levels. Transformation, meaning, of course, bringing all communities into the sector, all people from different backgrounds, different income levels, different ethnicities, what have you. One is, how do people get involved as owners in the sector or as investors in the sector? But obviously that's only for a smaller group of people who are in the position to own and invest. A second is for people to get involved as employees in the sector, as managers, as workers in the sector. And then thirdly, which links it all together, is really how people get involved as consumers, as beneficiaries of the sector who maybe buy products from the sector, tourism products, hunting products, meat products, what have you. So you think of transformation in, if you will, ownership and investment, employment, management, work positions, and as consumers, as people benefit from the sector and as a supply of goods and services that they want.
You're muted, Frank.
I see I got muted. To say if I'm unmuted now. Thank you very much. I could go on forever on mute, but Esther and Tobago say a few words about this topic of transformation and about how they see we might be able to move from the aspiration in our sector to actual implementation. What can be done, what governments might be able to do, what we can do at the community level. Esther's more experience with the community stuff, and Tobago maybe more on the private sector side, but where are the opportunities to move forward? Shall we start, Esther, with a few words from you? Are you okay to kick off? Just a couple minutes.
Okay, thank you so much. I think you have already introduced myself in terms of my name, Esther Nchiwongweni. I come from Limpopo, and I think that's where most of our wildlife activities are happening, including the 4 iconic species that we've already mentioned. I hold a BCom Honors Masters of Commerce. I'm the chair of African Community Conservationists, the chairperson also of Limpopo People and Parks. I'm full-time in terms of sustainable use with the communities. I run a number of concessions, the main concession being at Makuya Nature Reserve. I'm not sure if you want me to continue to comment or...
Yes, sure. It's just to say a few words and to open up our discussion from your perspective, and then we'll ask Tobago to say a few words as well.
Okay, thank you. I believe that African communities were born hunters and gatherers. That was even prior to our constitution. Our constitution, I think, was supportive to what used to be the culture and the tradition of our African communities. But also, if you look at the National Development Plan of the country, Vision 2030, it talks about inclusive rural economic development strategy, where we are expected as a nation to also include tourism, being sustainable use also, to try and develop our rural communities. And also, if you look at the DFFE, Department of Fisheries, Forestry and Environment, 2024 targets, they're very much circled around transformation, your wildlife economy nodes. And if you are to look closely also in the HLP report, they also touched on this wildlife economy nodes as important rural points where the wildlife economy can grow from, and making a lot of sense because that's where communal land is, and that's where these 4 iconic species are available. Thank you.
Okay, fabulous. So there's a direct link because of where the resources are and where the people are on this. Tobago, a few words from you.
Thank you, Frank. Good afternoon to everyone in the panel. My name is 𝐏𝐫𝐸𝐻𝐫 Mohashwa. I'm a board member at Wildlife Ranching South Africa, an organization that represents private game owners and private game ranchers in South Africa. Some of our members are also run hunting operations, and others are in ecotourism, as well as the full wildlife value chain. I myself am a private game rancher with my ranch out in the Thabazimbi area. So I could say that I speak largely for the private sector formation of the wildlife biodiversity economy. I've participated before the high-level panel. I've had experience in participating in the workshops of the Wildlife Biodiversity Economy Strategy, which was launched somewhere in 2019, where the President of the Republic actually endorsed the work of a 5-week workshop that developed the grand plan and a vision for the wildlife economy. And this high-level panel comes as one of the outcomes of that biodiversity economy strategy. And I've also had the privilege to serve amongst a group of highly talented individuals who were carefully handpicked out of all the people in South Africa to participate in this panel, where we've had robust discussions about the terms of reference of the work of the panel. In particular, today we are asked to respond to recommendations that have been put forward as it relates to transformation. And of course, for our country, transformation is a very touchy subject. It's a very broad subject. It's a subject that involves the economy of South Africa. And for the wildlife industry, is a subject that involves rural development, as well as creating opportunities for the marginalized people of our country who live around these wildlife developments, as well as places where people can engage with wildlife services and products. So by its very nature, the biodiversity economy is best positioned to create opportunities for those marginalized people in our communities through creating opportunities for inclusivity by employment, by consumption, as well as by making the people around those properties part of the wildlife economy. The history of the biodiversity economy in South Africa has been such that it has been an industry that has been reserved for a select few privileged people in our country. So the recommendations that are in that 500-page document as it relates to transformation have to find their way out of the cabinets of the officials at the DEF, as well as out of the cabinets of some of us who are in the industry into practice. So you mentioned to say, how do we take the aspiration into action? And it's not going to be a one-day game. It's going to be a bit of a 5-day game if you talk the cricket language. It's going to be a bit of a longer-term play where we have to be patient. We have to invest in skills first and foremost to empower the locals to become part of the industry. We have got to invest in communication programs to invite those that have the capacity to invest in the industry. I would like to take the analogy of golf to say, in the dawn of democracy, Black people were caddies in the golf course. If you saw a Black person, they were most likely a caddy to a white person. But if you go to a golf course today, 26 years later, you'll find Black people owning homes on golf courses and their children playing golf on a weekday. That has been transformation from the golf sector. They managed to say, I can imagine people like Gary Player sitting on a stoop one day to say, well, if golf is going to be relevant in the future of South Africa, we have got to get the majority of the people of this country into the sport. And they did it. And they built a big economy out of it. And I think we must congratulate those kind of leaders that did it quietly, and they developed it if you go around golf courses today in the whole of South Africa and did numbers, you'll see a significant amount of people from all sorts of ethnicities. Now, I think the same can be achieved for the wildlife industry. We've got to make the wildlife industry look fashionable, especially to the youth, because the youth are the future of this country. We've got to get it in the heads of the majority of the people of this country that the wildlife economy is as accessible to them as to anybody else. And indeed, we have got to spread the message that South Africa is the best place in the world for these wildlife experiences, largely because of the regulatory framework that we have. The ability to own game privately and the ability to own land privately is a privilege that most in the world do not have. As we know, most governments have adopted a very biocentric view of wildlife management, where all of the wildlife belong to the states, to the state or the government. We don't have that issue in South Africa. And indeed, we see that as an opportunity as private sector game ranchers. And that industry can only grow if we invite more investment into the industry and get the majority of the people of our country involved in that sector. So Frank, I'd like to stop there in the way of opening remarks and perhaps invite you to guide as to what next must be said. Thank you.
Okay, fabulous. Thank you very much, Esther and Tobacco, for kicking us off. Folks, if you'd like to put a comment or question in the chat, we can move that across, and then a little bit later on, we've got a big group, but we can also go live and ask for some live questions. One of the lines in the high-level panel report that I've been grappling with is, one of your recommendations is to position the wildlife sector as a preferred rural economic development strategy. Okay. First comment, yes, great, love it. And then I think about it, preferred to what? Well, the major way we've worked in the development strategy in the rural sectors has been agriculture. But it's not, is it agriculture versus wildlife, or is it managing wildlife like we manage agriculture as an efficient land use, as a way in which we can take Africa's natural resources and create jobs, create opportunities, create goods and services, build value chains around them. So I'm not so sure it's preferred over agriculture, but maybe, Esther and Tobacco, maybe it's a bit of looking at how we've had policy supporting agricultural development, and can we learn from those to have as much support for rural development through wildlife. That's my thinking, is a strategy that looks at wildlife as a viable land use option, if you will, for creating value and creating employment in the countryside. Esther, Tobacco, any comments?
Look, I think there's much value to be unlocked in the wildlife economy, precisely because we work on land that has very low agricultural output. Basically, it's marginal agricultural land. So the ability to create value in land that has otherwise no other use other than wildlife management and the wildlife economy is a great opportunity for the people of South Africa. Because indeed, in the areas where we conduct our wildlife enterprises, that land use indeed is the only viable option of any kind of economic activity. So therefore, there is an upside. There's an immense upside for the country and the economy if we consider and promote investments in those areas. Otherwise, there'll be no economic activity and poverty will just set in and continue to worsen what is already a very bad picture, I'm saying in terms of the economy. And part of the work that we do in the wildlife sector is to reverse, or let's say slow down, the impact of urbanization. We want to support our country in creating opportunities for people in those areas where they come from, whether be it through hunting opportunities, through game breeding opportunities, as well as value addition of wildlife products like taxidermy, as well as game meat production. In time, we will also solve for food security once we get our South African Meat Safety Act through the approval processes of Parliament. Another important factor, Frank, is the wildlife economy is best positioned to challenge conventional wisdom. And let me just explain what I mean by that, is that the structure of the South African economy is such that the supply value chain for commodities has already been established for most commodities. But for the wildlife industry, there is none. We can sell our product from our farm directly to a consumer, whereas other farmers cannot do that. You know, if you farm with cattle or with other type of agricultural produce, you always got to go through a large food processor like a Tiger Brands or those kind of companies, and ultimately through one of the major food distributors being Shoprite, Checkers, Pick n Pay, and the like. Whereas for our products, we've got the ability to produce on our farm and find a direct route to market that does not involve many intermediaries, much like you have in other sectors of our economy. And this, for me, is a big differentiator, and it's something that perhaps through the correct policy formulation, such as the South African Meat Safety Act, and perhaps other legal instruments that can be developed to support the biodiversity economy, indeed, we should be able to develop those direct routes to market and derive a great value for investors in our industry. Thank you.
Tobacco, great. It's a real business approach to the sector that we need to hear. Esther, come in. Yes, I wanted to ask you about how you see this importance of the sector from a Limpopo community perspective.
I talk more on community perspective because that's where I spend time on with communities in the wildlife economy. Ours as communities is very simple. It's not even complicated. Like when I started, I indicated that our communities were gatherers and hunters. But then with time, we get to a stage where we started looking into employment, looking into growing economy through this hunting, through this tourism. Now, there are a number of challenges for our communities to benefit. And some of the challenges are regulatory because, for example, if you look at where the world is going currently, from the West, they're no longer, not all the countries are still supporting sustainable use. And sometimes when we talk of sustainable use, I always ask myself whether we understand what we mean. Because for me, sustainable use means even tourism. because as people drive in and out watching animals using cameras, they are again sustainably utilizing our resources. But then our communities expect to benefit, if you may count percentage-wise, 90% of the monies of the benefits, economic benefits, because as rural communities, we believe that we are the owners of the land, and therefore we are the ones who suffer by staying side by side with these iconic species. But then, as we continue to get to the smoother part of sustainable use, saying, well, hunting is no longer acceptable, well, it's only tourism, I believe that both hunting and tourism can contribute heavily economically to the benefit of our communities. You have asked a question around whether wildlife economy goes hand in hand with agriculture or one at a time. I think it depends on the land use. Land use dictates whether this part can be used for wildlife or it can only be used for agriculture. But what is making it more difficult with our communities? Like I've already indicated, the regulatory challenges, where they will tell you that some of the areas has to be declared as protected areas. And once they are declared, from the community point of view, from the community wildlife economic culture and tradition is very limiting. You find that in terms of medication that is obtainable from these protected areas, communities are no longer going to be able to access those medicines because the area is a protected area. Same when it comes to hunting. The way hunting is currently being done, it's one-sided. It only focuses on money, money, money only. We're no longer even considering the traditional uses of certain parts of animals and how these communities are going to access those parts of animals for traditional use. I should think South Africa has to try and balance the two. Yes, economy, but also consider community culture and tradition. Thank you.
Oh, excellent points. Really excellent. Thank you, Edith. The point about land uses and land use options and whether it's ecological, is wildlife make sense versus agriculture, or whether there's legal constraints like setting up a protected area is really, really important. Those are key parts of it. A couple of folks have made a couple of comments here. Derek, I'll come to you next. Let me see if Professor Kennedy Zama from Stellenbosch, who made a comment earlier on, would like to say a word about the interface between agriculture and wildlife economy. Professor Zama, are you able to say a word or two?
Thanks, Frank. I posted something in the chat there. Well, our approach has always been to think of these two issues, not in competition, but rather, in some complementary fashion of some sort. It's intuitively not the easiest thing to do, but it needs, quite a bit of sitting down of the stakeholders who, in many cases, might have very divergent views of how they go about achieving their goals. But there are examples of where this has been done and could actually also be done here. So I'm really looking forward to hearing more views from all these participants. Actually, I must congratulate you, Frank, for putting together such a panel and contributors from all walks of life within the wildlife community. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what they think about this. So my point there that I put in there was to sort of ignite the discussion in that direction as well. But obviously, looking forward to lots of other contributions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kennedy. Thank you. Derek, would you like to? Derek is somebody who farms rhinos, so he's certainly in the thick of this. And then after Derek, maybe I can ask Clive to say a few words from his comment. But over to you, Derek, for an intervention.
Thank you. I just wanted to raise one key point, I guess the elephant in the room, that from my perspective, there are three components if we really want to unleash transformation in this arena. One is, of course, willingness on the part of those of us who are already in place to share, right? And that's sharing expertise, it's sharing resources, it's sharing game, especially in the rhino space. It'd be very hard for people not in this game without the investment of significant capital to access rhinos. So there's certainly that component. The second component is, of course, the knowledge within.
Oops.
To see where these opportunities lie and how can they best engage. So there's a coming together that needs to take place, and that's a role that government can play, and that many of us, including one of your keynote speakers and myself, have invested heavily in working towards, bringing the parties together so that we can share learnings and knowledge. But the fundamental issue here is that wildlife cannot play a role in transformation unless it is profitable. So all too many of the people in this space currently are on their last legs financially. They're being brutalized by the situation on the ground with COVID and hunting shutdowns, but also by a bureaucracy that is determined and that has shown itself with this new policy to be more determined to obstruct trade than to facilitate trade. And so there's this massive amount of upside that is ready to be unlocked. And only when it's unlocked is there something to share. You can't encourage communities to get involved in things that are just money pits. But if there is real upside to be enjoyed, then getting communities to prioritize involvement in this over other forms of agriculture or other forms of economic activity becomes very easy. So I guess I'll throw this to the others for comment, but I think we get a lot further if government acts to facilitate economic gain rather than to shut it down. We have to have something to share before we can share. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Derek. I was thinking of the comment, hunting's all about money, money, money. Well, maybe it's not money, 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 but we do need a little bit of money for this thing to work. Money has to be in there. And as Tebogo was saying, there's a whole chain of values that can be unlocked and can be developed. Clive, you were talking about regenerative agriculture. Does wildlife fit into that? And is transformation part of a regenerative model? Clive Poultney.
Frank, thank you very much. I was just linking, actually my comment in the chat box was linking to what Kennedy had said, because I also come from the conservation, with a conservation background, and I just believe that we could do ourselves a disservice in terms of what we're trying to achieve in conservation context if we look to conservation to provide all that income that we're talking about to develop livelihoods. So perhaps we could look at a more diversified model. And I'm talking in particular about all the restituted land that people have, and starting to utilize that land as efficiently as possible. Perhaps a diversified strategy where you bring in regenerative agriculture, and that includes restoring biodiversity, using cattle, sheep, goats. There's a lot of methodologies around, probably pioneered by Alan Savory, that we could use to build livelihoods and wealth, create profit, and restore biodiversity areas where we could rewild areas, which then could generate some income through hunting and tourism, etc. But definitely looking at a much broader model rather than too niched and putting too much pressure on one particular pillar to carry the can.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. It's very interesting. Tobacco, we've got the issues, Tobacco, of what the landscape can actually do, and the challenge is then to use it as efficiently as we can, whether it's agriculture, wildlife, mixed uses, and what have you. But getting back to the transformation topic, what role do you see about private sector ranchers working more closely with communities, and, if you will, not waiting for Pretoria to come up with policies, but actually engaging on the ground in Limpopo, in Mpumalanga, Eastern Cape, and what have you, and moving towards a community private sector partnership in the wildlife economy?
Frank, I think we already willing partners with communities. We are already partnering with communities in all our ranches around South Africa. We certainly don't need any policy to instruct us to do that. But certainly where policy will assist is in supporting that transformation drive. You know, I mentioned the issue of skills previously, and also access to financing. You know, we have development finance institutions that could play a role in funding transformation in wildlife. You know, the money has got to come from somewhere. The opportunity is there. I take the point that currently the industry is taking strain because of COVID and other reasons of a fledgling economy. But there will be a time where the economy turns around, as this is also thought to be the Great Reset. And the question is, how do we use this time where the economy is low to prepare from the time when the economy does reset and the wildlife economy in South Africa could then be best positioned to take advantage of the Great Reset? And perhaps we ought to take time to reflect on how we can take the issue of transformation more seriously by way, yes, of working closer more with our communities, specifically to respond to that, and also to broaden the consumption of our services. I think that there's an opportunity in growing our market such that we place less reliance on international trade and create demand locally such that we create our own market, so to speak. So yes, for me, certainly I tend to be a glass half full type of guy. I'm not going to sit here and say things are bad. I'm going to say when things are bad, let's prepare for when the tide turns, because they won't be bad forever. Thank you.
Esther, listening in on this discussion, you earlier on talked about sustainable use, of course, includes tourism. Hunting's a part of tourism. It's a part of sustainable use. But you also mentioned local demand for wildlife products, uses, traditional uses that local communities have. And to what extent could we develop a wildlife economy that's inclusive of those demands? So it's not just about the tourist coming from London or the hunter coming from the States. It's about local people using products for local uses, traditional food, and so on. Do you see a role for developing these this local economy, which then builds off of what Tebogo said, is having an economy that's based on really meeting local demand and, of course, international demand, but primarily focused on utilizing wildlife for local uses? Your thoughts, Esther?
Thanks, Francis. Yes, the demand for local uses in terms of herbal medicine is very high as we speak. But access to those herbal medicines is very, very difficult because of what I said to the panel. In most cases, most of these areas are declared, they are protected areas. And once they are protected, there are a lot of restrictions that makes it difficult for local people to have access to those medicines. Now, if this regulatory challenge is to be relooked into as a way of opening up a market to local use, you'll find that the economy will also grow at rural areas. If you look at the total numbers of the Inyangas, the Sangomas in our areas, we have a lot of them, and most of them are registered. But they are finding it very difficult for them to access these medicines, either from the animals or from the plants. So the market is there. It just needs to be opened up through regulatory reform.
Fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. There's a lot of good chat going on in the chat box. Fabulous chats here. If anybody's picked up on some. Lulama, can I call on you next to intervene?
Thank you very much, Francis.
Welcome.
I am also speaking from the perspective of a community, particularly those living around protected areas. When we start talking about transformation, I think the first thing is for us to be sensitive to who is affected by what is happening now. And what difference can we make in order to make this particular person not just a participant, a willing and a happy participant in the economy? We all know, particularly in our country, when these protected areas were established, a lot of people were moved away from their areas. And this did not consider the fact that their lifestyles were intertwined with the environment. For instance, those people depended for their meat on the wild animals. For instance, the springboks and the lot used to be part of the meat supply of the people. Because as Esther said, we were hunters and gatherers. Now, if you are just going to come and tell somebody you're not going to hunt, what are you saying to that person? You are saying you are taking his or her birthright and a constitutional right away. And if you don't put something in place, how do you expect that person to survive? And this is when we are opening the back door to poachers, because they are going to offer them money because they are not benefiting from the activities of this. So it is in the best interest of people in the industry already to try and push transformation, because if they do so, they win the confidence and the loyalty of the people around the parks. And in that way, the people are also going to protect conservation, because it's conservation that benefits them, unlike poachers who will be getting money, giving them 10%, 10 or even 1% of what they're going to make out of this. So the most important thing, I think, first of all, is to open up access into the industry as a whole. When I say access into the industry, I mean the whole value chain. We do not expect farms to be taken from the owners and be given to the people around us. No, because not everybody wants that, number one. Number two, not everybody can handle that. It's the involvement. For instance, the first involvement where there's a majority of people is as laborers, which is not particularly satisfactory. But if we skill them such that a person can move anywhere in the industry and have a skill that is recognized, and as such will get him a job wherever he goes within the industry, that will be a starting point. And then secondly, in our employment policies, we make it a target that at all the levels, we get the local people people living around the parks employed so that they learn the skills not only as laborers, also becoming more technical, and we also allow them at a more higher, which is scientific, and even higher, which is more managerial, so that the industry has got the PDIs involved in the industry as their jobs. People, you would be surprised to know how people protect an industry because they are protecting their own jobs. And that only happens when they feel that they have got jobs and those jobs are meaningful to them. And they can carry them anyway. And unfortunately, in our country, as at this moment, the types of skills that those people have, most of them are not certificated. I'm not saying all of them. Most of them are not certificated. This person has to work in this farm or ranch forever, because when he leaves, he's got nothing to take that's going to say, I am a qualified tracker or something. They have done tracking on the job, I mean, officially, on academically, and also on the job. I've got so many years of experience, and as such, I can code. And then, last but not least, I think we need to create a market locally. And what market? The very market that seems to be the elephant in the room, the hunting market. If you notice, there are very few PDIs in that market. And this is a problem, having learned from COVID, because it makes us depend on international customers, clients, or whatever you want to call them. And once something like COVID comes in, then that business is almost dead. So we need, then how do we do this? In terms of communication and advertising, whatever you want to call the approach, make sure that our kids get to know about conservation. They get to know of all the professions, or will I call them professions, careers, or whatever they can get out of this. Then in that way, we are expanding the market, because just like the example that was used by 𝐏𝐫𝐸𝐽, golf used to be thought of as a white man's sport. But somebody did something about it, and now everybody's comfortable in it, and there's business, even more business, for the people who are keen on building golf courses and developing the land around golf courses. The same thing can be done with biodiversity industry. Get the people interested, get them skilled, and facilitate their entry. Assist with access to funding, which is the last one I'm going to talk about, because for those few that would really want to get in at the end of, at the upper end of things, that can also be a challenge. Access to funding. We need to talk about ways and means of accessing fund by the PDIs to make sure that they get into that industry and give it the importance importance and meaning that it deserves in South Africa. Thank you very much.
Lulama, those are excellent comments. I do hope our minister's listening in, because there's a lot she could learn from this discussion. One second, quick. I'll come to you, Merlyn, in just 1 second. The both Lulama and Esther mentioned the link with protected areas and the challenges of protected areas restricting use and access. Just as an advertisement, that's what we'll be talking about in the next conversation on Thursday, is looking at the relationship between communities, private sector, and protected areas. But first, I just lost it. Lost it now. There's so many. Who's up here next? Merlyn, are you up? Or did we lose you?
I'm here, Frank. Thank you.
Oh, there you are. Okay. You know, with Zoom, people just disappear on these little screens. Sorry about that. Hi. Hello. Over to you.
Thank you for the opportunity to say a few words. I'm very grateful for this platform, and I'm looking forward to learning a lot. I just wanted to pose a thought, share thought, maybe even ask a question to members of the panel or any of the astute colleagues here. Whilst I have a lot of opinions and thoughts about all the points that have been raised, I wanted to know if there's any way of unlocking the invisible part of the non-tangible part of the wildlife economy through means of patents and if I can say patents on branding and patents on knowledge. There's been a lot of talk about communities, about traditions, about places, and we know that a lot of symbolism and identity is attached to these places, these communities, and these traditions. And conservation and the wildlife economy in Africa all around has been the greatest culprit of being culture vultures, you know, setting up lodges and branding them around a people's identity when they do not benefit at all from the branding that goes into that tourism, that goes into products that are in the gift shop, that goes into medicines that are packaged, you know. Right now, we have issues of patents over COVID vaccines, but when it comes to African medicine and African knowledge and communities and their knowledge, anybody can just package it up in a packet and doesn't need to pay any royalties or any benefits to the communities they have harvested that resource from or knowledge from. Are there any provisions in the work around the wildlife economy to make sure that communities can be enriched from the use of their identities, their brand, from the use of their traditional indigenous knowledge, and so on and so forth? That's the thought I wanted to bring to the fore. Thank you.
Merlyn, you brought up a very, very interesting part that a lot of us who often think about the wildlife economy as four-legged creatures in savannas forget to talk about genetic resources and indigenous knowledge. And in fact, when the government of South Africa set up their biodiversity economy framework, wildlife economy was one part, and the other part was all about access and benefit sharing to these indigenous knowledge and to the use of resources, which is sometimes called biotrade. It's under internationally, it's under the Nagoya Protocol of the Biodiversity Convention, and it's a hugely important area. And, you know, until listening to you, I didn't really connect the dots to transformation, but it makes a lot of sense if we're talking about transformation to also think about people's rights to their knowledge and to their uses traditionally and how they can be empowered with that and have, as you say, patents, have ownership rights to that. And I do know it's in the architecture of the thinking on the biodiversity economy, but how that actually gets implemented is the next step. We've got a few minutes left, so let me turn it back to Esther and Tebogo to say a few words, listening to the conversation and also reading some of the chats. Tebogo, do you want to jump in?
Well, thank you, Frank. I think this has been a very useful discussion, and also just leaning on the chats. I think really the question that needs to be answered is how do we give effect to all the recommendations? And indeed, you know, skills development and funding and communication are the three pillars that I think could bring some of these recommendations to life, as well as balancing, of course, with those of us in the sector from a conservation side. From a conservation side, we need to also take everyone along with us. It cannot be a game blame of us and them, and it also within the sustainable use formation, the fragmentation has to stop. People must all drive in one direction for the interest of the industry. really, and I think that this fireside chat is helping in getting the conversation going. And for me, yeah, it's been a privilege to be here with you today and with everyone around the room. Thank you.
Thank you, Tebogo. Esther, some comments from you, and maybe comments also on some of the chat comments going on.
Thank you, Francis. I just do not know why it's like the participant feel that it's going to take a bit of some time for us to achieve transformation in the wildlife economy. If you look at the recommendations which you have sent to us from the HLP report, they are very straightforward and they are achievable. I want to make a comment on what Derek Livington has proposed from the rhino sector. Most of these communities that we worry a lot when it comes to transformation, they own vast land. And if we are to allow partnership between these communities and the rhino sector as proposed, and also get government to open up the markets in terms of trading rhino horn, including the specimens, I can tell you transformation is going to happen very quickly. But we cannot expect transformation to happen when we're not sure of the market nationally and internationally. So one of my recommendations will be to give it a try between communities and the private sector who own one or all these iconic species like your rhinos to work together and get government to support. The other comment from my side, the previous speaker who spoke about the branding around these big tourism establishments, who we're not even sure if communities are benefiting or not. In most cases, communities are not benefiting. And in most cases, these big brands of tourism are happening in communal land. It looks like the few companies that are interested in these big brands, they do that to make money, but forgetting that they can only make money on communal land and they have to make sure that the landowners are happy. So transformation can be achievable. It's just that we as the country, we keep on engaging each other on transformation and again as a way of buying time without even action things to make it happen. If you look at the recommendation from the HLP report, that of wildlife economy nodes as a key point in terms of rural development in the wildlife economy, it's viable, it's doable, because those wildlife economy nodes have been identified and they've already been put forward by the department to support and to fund. So what is left is only the private sector and the communities to sit together and table a proposal to the government to support. Thank you.
Esther, that was brilliant, an absolutely brilliant comment. I think what I've heard in the last hour is the business case for transformation from a wildlife economy perspective. Why transformation isn't just a nice to have, but it's actually critical to ensuring that this sector develops and goes forward. If it's not an inclusive sector, it's not going to happen. We can talk about how we manage rhinos and elephants and whether we export horn or captive breed lions, but none of that is going to make any sense at all unless it's at the ground level, on the ground with communities and with the private sector, that we can come together and develop a transformed sector that then can take the issues and grapple with them. So folks, I'm afraid, what a fabulous crowd, absolutely fabulous. I'm afraid we've run out of time, but 1 hour I think is enough. We all Zoomed to death over the last year and a half. So we thought 1 hour, we stop the next session on next same time on Thursday. And you've had the invites. We'll be on looking at this link to the protected areas, which has already come up today. And then, as I said, next week, we'll talk about hunting and developing a standard, which is really a standard about the standards about the sector. Hunting is a case study. Teresa, in a comment earlier on from the Southern African Wildlife College, talked about responsible use. And that's really the theme on the hunting standard. And then we'll look at two of the species that are most talked about, the rhinos and the lions, and this whole discussion we're having in the new policy. But why don't I leave it at that? It's top of the hour at 4 o'clock. And thank you everybody for coming in for the hour. And I hope it was useful. And many thanks to 𝐿'𝐵𝐻𝑜 and to Esther. And then finally, a big thanks to Stellenbosch University for allowing the Institute to have a home, and to the Oppenheimer Generations Research and Conservation Group for supporting our work. So thanks everybody, and we'll hopefully see a number of you again on Thursday.
Thank you, Frank.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.